Say what you want to say. I have no interest in the Crawford fight. It does not interest me. They might find a way to interest me. They can entice me. But I've never felt that interested. I was interested in the Danny Garcia fight when he moved up. And Danny Garcia had a lot of credentials before he moved up. He dominated a weight class that didn't have 140-pounders in it.
Another piss poor display from what is the WBA's welterweight champion Keith Thurman, where he admits he has no interest in facing Terrence Crawford. Oh, he was interested in fighting Danny Garcia upon his ascension into the welterweight division, but it does appear that Keith Thurman cannot maintain the same energy with Crawford that he did with Danny Garcia. One must question why. Why is that? Is it because when Danny moved up to the welterweight division, what a lot of people were saying is that Danny is fish food, that he doesn't stand a chance against those guys, that Danny was perceived as the underdog in situations that would involve a Keith Thurman, a Errol Spence, a Sean Porter, whereas in the case of Terrence Crawford, people feel that he's equipped for the task, that he's equipped for the job. Is that the difference? That Danny moving up, he's seen as an underdog. Terrence Crawford moving up, he's seen as a live animal. And maybe that's the reason that Keith Thurman, Chief Queef Thurman, cannot maintain the same energy. I'll tell you the truth that it's no secret. It's something that we talk about here on the channel, that Keith Thurman does not act like a hungry fighter anymore. He's acting like a fat and happy fighter. He's acting like a fighter who's been there and done that and no longer has anything to prove. And that's simply not the case. I mean, look at the difference between how Keith Thurman discusses potential matchups in the welterweight division and how Terrence Crawford discusses potential matchups in the welterweight division. Terrence Crawford is acting like a guy who debuted a couple of fights ago. He still feels that he has something to prove.
Like I said, I want all the welterweights.
Hey, you was real. I love it. I told him I want that word. This ain't no Keith Thurman shit. That's why we be scared and shit.
Say what you want to say. I have no interest in the Crawford fight. It does not interest me.
You think about how this guy sounds, how he talks about potential matchups and what you hear, and you realize that he's in the same age group as Terrence Crawford, but he's talking as if he's a more experienced and or more accomplished fighter than Terrence Crawford. And that's not the case. Terrence Crawford is in fact the more accomplished guy of the two, and he's the older fighter. Yet he's exhibiting more vim, more vigor, more willingness to prove himself and test his mettle against the best available competition. Whereas when you ask Keith Thurman,
solved with the call-outs, period. So basically he wants you to bring back that energy. You're not calling people out no more. Who you calling out after this fight?
First off, man, you know, the call-outs was because I was young and hungry and they wasn't paying me my just dues. That makes you real frustrated as a fighter. But now I've been champion for a long time. You can say what you want about me, baby. I'm getting the best fights in the sport of boxing.
He calls himself the truth. But if you were raised like I was raised in a biblical household, you know that there's a lot of false prophets.
Chill out. We ain't doing all that. We're not doing all that.
What do you think when he says that about you?
There's a lot of false prophets, baby.
If I'm a false prophet, you gotta prove it. You gotta prove I'm a false prophet.
Hey, I'm a true seeker, baby.
Whatever. Try that body shot, man. I'm gonna stop you. That shit gonna be easy work. I promise you.
I seek out the truth.
You don't you got to man. As soon as I won that title, you got injured. You got injured. As soon as I won the title,
look,
you got injured.
Like I don't want more money in my bank account. Like I don't want more money in my bank account.
Once I get that WBC belt, you gonna retire.
You ain't gonna get it.
How I'm not gonna get it? You gonna get injured again. You gonna get injured again.
Wait till I hit you. You gonna sleep. You gonna look like
on my life.
You gonna look like Benavidez.
Who?
You.
He had one leg.
You gonna look like
he had one leg.
He had one leg. I'm gonna make you stake your leg.
And Errol knows. I ain't no bullshitter. Errol knows. He's on my tail end. And why am I gonna fight the best fight out there today when I can fight it tomorrow for more money?
Who? He can't be the boogeyman if I'm chasing him.
I'm the dog of the division. I'm the boogeyman.
You can't be the boogeyman if I'm chasing you.
Everyone knows I'm that guy.
You're not that guy.
I'm that guy.
Numbers don't lie, and I'm the number one guy.
I'm that guy. You're not the number one guy.
Numbers don't lie.
You signed for 3.5 fight. I've been here.
Everybody got ESPN.
Terry, who's a better basketball player?
Me. Anything about him is me. Me.
You can ask Bronner who the best basketball
And I killed him for the bread.
You
Him
ask
and
Bronner
his
who the
boys.
best basketball.
I'm just saying, folks. You don't have to be Dr. Phil
Help me.
to see that there's a difference in the demeanor
Help
between
you.
these two fighters, respective of the same situation. That when confronted with the prospect of facing an Errol Spence, Keith Thurman can't keep the same energy that he keeps for other fighters. Whereas you make that proposition to Terrence Crawford, and he is all ears. Okay? And yet, these guys are in the same age group. Keith Thurman's 30, Terrence Crawford's 31. But out of the two guys, you know, the hungrier fighter just so happens to be the more accomplished fighter as well. Where Keith Thurman, you know, was a unified champion in one weight class, Terrence Crawford is a two-time lineal champion, undisputed champion, and 3-division champion overall. The facts are the facts. One of these guys has unseated more world champions overall than the other. These are all familiar talking points. These are all areas that we've covered in the past. But what really gets me about Keith Thurman's recent comments isn't that Keith Thurman is openly ducking Terrence Crawford, having openly criticized him, openly taken shots at him. But what gets me isn't that Keith Thurman is openly ducking Terrence Crawford. What really gets me is these comments in retrospect with what the narrative has been.
And what's it been?
You've got to pay attention to what people have been saying. People have been saying that if Terrence Crawford wanted those kinds of fights with those kinds of fighters, then what he should have done was cross over to the PBC side of the street. But in light of these comments, you listen to him, and I don't know about you guys, but I'm thinking to myself that you guys wanted him to cross the street to do what? To get hit with this fucking bullshit?
And why am I gonna fight the best fight out there today when I can fight it tomorrow for more money?
Take your time with it so that you can process it. That there are a lot of people out there that like to say that if Terrence Crawford wanted those kinds of fights with those kinds of fighters, what he should have done was cross the street. And I'm thinking to myself, cross the street for what? Errol Spence and Keith Thurman are on the same side of the street, and you see the shit that Keith's hitting Errol with.
Right.
So if Terrence Crawford crossed that street, what the fuck makes you think Keith wouldn't have hit Crawford with the same shit he's hitting Errol with?
And why am I gonna fight the best fight out there today when I can fight it tomorrow for more money?
And yet people have the audacity to say that, oh, Terrence should have crossed the street. And I'm thinking, cross the street for what?
For what?
Errol and Keith are on the same side of the street, and that's not stopping Keith from hitting Errol with that bullshit. So what the fuck makes you think Keith wouldn't have hit Crawford with that same bullshit he's hitting Errol with? The bottom line is that there are people out there who actually try to levy criticism towards Terrence Crawford and his situation, who he's fighting, as if that's a result of him not crossing the street. Yet, what we're seeing here is, hey, he could have been on the same side of the street as Keith, but that don't guarantee that Keith would have fought him. So why are people chastising him? In all honesty, the story here isn't that Keith Thurman is openly ducking Terrence Crawford, having openly criticized him, openly taken shots at him. The story here isn't that Keith Thurman is now openly ducking him.
It's not.
The real story here is, why are people out there trying to levy criticism towards Terrence Crawford and trying to take shots at him for what he is reduced to having to do, fighting the likes of an Amir Khan, fighting the likes of an Egidigus Kavaliauskas? Why is he being chastised for that when it's pretty obvious that if he's reduced to fighting those kinds of guys, it's because of people like Keith Thurman? It's not even about being on the same side of the street as a fighter like that, because there are guys that are on that same side of the street and Keith won't fight them either. That shit wouldn't have made the least bit of difference. That's really what the bottom line is, and that's what the story is. You know, in the beginning, when Keith Thurman first started taking shots at Terrence Crawford, unprovoked shots, by the way, you know, I thought to myself, is this a prelude to what could be a fight between them? Is that what Keith Thurman is doing? Is he, setting the stage and putting down the building blocks for what could be a Terrence Crawford versus Keith Thurman fight? That's what I thought in the beginning. But hindsight being 2020, it's pretty clear to see that if Keith Thurman has been taking shots at Terrence Crawford, it's not because he means to fight him, it's because he's angry and resentful that Terrence Crawford stole his thunder. That the conversation used to be about Keith Thurman versus Errol Spence, but in his absence, it became about Terrence Crawford and Errol Spence. And you know, Keith, he wanted to beat his chest and remind everybody that he beat Sean Porter and Danny Garcia. He wanted to get the attention back on him, but once he got it, he realized what came with it. That, okay, if you're gonna sit here taking shots at that guy, we can only assume that it's because you mean to fight that guy, right? I mean, what other reason would there be for you to openly take shots at Terrence Crawford? And once that's what the conversation became about, Keith Thurman had no choice but to show his cards that he has no intention of fighting Terrence Crawford, and he's just a bullshitter. This brings us to an article that was published 5 days ago via Boxing Scene, where Errol Spence was quoted as saying that, he thinks that Keith Thurman is a cornball, that he's a corny individual. And he was talking about how, there were some comments from Sean Porter. Comments stating that Sean thinks that Errol is jealous, that, he thinks he hates him, and Errol expressed that he's indifferent towards Sean Porter. He doesn't have any animosity towards him, and as far as being jealous, well, that's a load of bullshit because Errol's been on pay-per-view and Sean Porter has not. And the guy who he actually does have some kind of animosity towards, at least according to Errol Spence, was Keith Thurman. That he's wanted to lock horns with Keith Thurman as far back as when Errol was 14-0. He's wanted to fight that guy for a long time, and that's the guy who he doesn't like. That's the guy who, if he's got a bone to pick with somebody, that would be the guy. He views him as a corny individual. And I think that a lot of people are looking at Keith Thurman in that light right now. I mean, it's odd that Keith Thurman is about to participate in what is the biggest fight of his career. In many ways, that's what this Pacquiao fight is. It's odd to see that Keith Thurman has gotten to that point to where he can get a Pacquiao fight, but he's nobody's sweetheart. Nobody really likes this fucking guy. Nobody's really fucking with him. They're tired of his bullshit. They're tired of his sound bites, and they think he's just a fucking gimmick. I think it's poetic justice that Keith Thurman has come under fire as much as he has in recent memory. I do think it's poetic justice, because Keith Thurman was a fighter who used to levy these kinds of criticisms towards a more accomplished fighter than himself, a more accomplished fighter then than he is today. But that didn't stop Keith Thurman from criticizing Floyd Mayweather, who he now seems to be trying to emulate.
This is why now I understand Floyd. Most people don't know shit about boxing, and I'm just trying to have the best career I can have. Now, I want to have exciting fights, but I need to have exciting fights at the right moments for me at my career.
Keith Thurman is often seen these days offering up just these kinds of explanations as to why he's navigating his career in the fashion that he is. And yet, way back when Floyd Mayweather was a far more established fighter than Keith Thurman is today, when Floyd Mayweather had everybody and a mother trying to kick down his door to get a fucking fight, Keith Thurman didn't offer up any considerations, understanding, or sympathy for his plight, and Mayweather was then a more established fighter than Keith Thurman is now. So if Keith Thurman wasn't cutting Mayweather any slack, I don't see why he would expect anyone to cut him any slack when he is not half the fighter today that Floyd Mayweather was back then. This is the poetic justice that I'm talking about, ladies and gentlemen. This is the universe and the cosmos playing a practical joke on Keith Thurman, who by all rights is just another Mayweather wannabe. You got a lot of guys like this, They haven't put in quite the same amount of work that a Floyd Mayweather had. You understand? That they haven't. I mean, Keith Thurman today is nowhere near the fighter that Floyd Mayweather was yesterday in terms of marquee value and skill set and resume, quality of competition, the number of world champions that he had unseated at that point. Keith Thurman is not the equivalent. He is not equivocal
to Floyd Mayweather.
And yet he finds himself under fire. But the reason that people don't lend Thurman the sympathy that they lended Floyd Mayweather is because, well, by that time, Floyd Mayweather had already racked up a hell of a lot of fucking names, already. So you didn't need to doubt him. Whereas in the case of Keith Thurman, who was critical of just such a fighter, you haven't done enough to get the considerations that he got. So he's getting all of it, the full brunt of it, the full brunt of the criticism, the backlash from the fans, and even his colleagues are losing respect for him because if you ask Errol Spence, Keith Thurman is a motherfucking cornball. It just brings me back to what I said about a fighter who's about to debut on pay-per-view, that, usually at that time, the perception that the fans have of a fighter like that is that that fighter is the next sensation, the hungry young lion, that the fruit of all his efforts is about to come into fruition, because now he's crossing over and the powers that be have felt so inclined to put that fighter on a pay-per-view. Essentially, the perception of such a fighter in most of those situations when a guy's in his pay-per-view debut is that this is a hungry young lion. Whereas in the case of Keith Thurman, yeah, he's about to make his pay-per-view debut, but nobody looks at him as being a hungry young lion. They don't. That's not the perception that people have of Keith Thurman. The perception that they have of him is that he's just an opportunist. And little more than that. They don't view him as one of these young, hungry warrior kings in the sport of boxing. You know, a warrior king like a Terrence Crawford. And, you know, if you ask me, to a lesser extent, a warrior king like Errol Spence. But better still, those guys are viewed as young, hungry lions who are warrior kings. And that is not the perception that people have of Keith Thurman. It's not. He strikes everyone as more of a bureaucrat, a politician, than a warrior king. An opportunist, yeah, definitely, but just not a hungry young lion. And that's what resonates with me the most, that Keith Thurman may be about to be in the biggest fight of his career, but the perception that people have of him is not
what you'd expect.
What you would expect from a guy who's about to debut on pay-per-view.